Okay, so last week we were talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, and we watched the first video, which kind of goes through the argument that's presented in the book here. And it talks about, well, actually, before we do that, let's see again, because like hopefully you are not just like reading, well, hopefully you read it. We should start with that, right? So, but like I said, try to commit these arguments to memory because it's very helpful to have them on cue. And this one's the easiest one of them all, I think, right? So what's the first premise of this argument?
Whatever begins to exist has a cause.
Without looking at the flow chart, yeah. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2 is
The universe
exists.
No, that's the third one, you guys.
It's causes.
No.
That's the last
Wait, what was the first one again?
whatever begins to exist as a cause.
The universe
Universe
exists.
exists.
That's what I said.
That's what I said.
No, isn't it? If
You're close.
No, I thought it was.
The
it was
universe
whatever-
began to
The
exist.
universe began to exist.
Oh, that's boom.
Therefore,
The universe has a cause.
the universe has a
Yes.
cause. All right.
Singular word. Oh,
Right.
come on.
Now
buddy.
again, let's.
Rely on
But this is good because how does this argument relate with the Leibnizian argument, which is about contingency, right?
Oh,
So remember that one? Everything that exists has an explanation of its cause, either in
its own existence or
well,
its.
we got to be.
Necessity of its
Wording is
existence.
very, very important in this because again, my what I'd like to do is
wait.
I've been watching this atheist thing. He critiques all of Craig's videos. So I'm like, okay, good. Maybe we'll critique his critique of the video. Right?
And then some will critique our critique.
But if you watch his stuff, it's all about being very precise with what we say, right? So the first thing is everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in
The necessity.
the necessity of its own nature or
Isn't it the cause of something else?
in an external cause, something outside itself, right? Right. And then the second premise is the second premise of that argument was what?
Big words, okay.
Premise of
The
that
universe
is.
began to- Wait, no. Nothing has to exist necessarily.
Well, remember, so everything that exists has an explanation. So then the second part of that would be, because we're talking about the universe,
Anything that began to exist. No.
if the universe has an explanation,
it must be good.
it must be God, right? And that relates to the Kalam thing, because if it doesn't have an explanation, then what must be true about the universe?
The universe is necessary.
It exists.
It would be necessary and it would also be
Eternal.
eternal. So
But
you
we
connecting
know-
the dots here?
But we know it's not eternal because
Well,
of that.
yeah, but the point is that like that's why if it has an explanation, the explanation has to be God, because again, what are the other options? Like it has to be something that's not part of
Yeah.
space time universe, right? That's here. So it has to be something that's outside that brought everything that exists contingently into existence. Yes.
If the universe didn't have a start, wouldn't it just turn into the soup that they were talking about in the book before?
Well,
It would just
The-
freeze eventually.
there are theories that people have tried to put forward that try to make the universe like a cyclical thing, like it expands and then it will get to a certain point where then it starts to contract again and stuff. But again, that's part of the point in the Kalam video that we watched last week with Borg, Guth, and Belenkin said that any universe that's expanding cannot be past time infinite, right? So in other words, there's no like rebound.
Gravity doesn't.
You can't like reset it and put it back together. Like if it's expanding, then you could go backwards and it has to have a beginning. That's what they said, right? So that was part of the argument. Okay, and again, the third part of the first argument that we talked about was that the universe exists, and so from them you know that therefore it has to have a cause, and that cause has to be God. This argument is saying whatever begins to exist. So from the second premise of the contingency argument, we're saying that the universe isn't eternal and it's not necessary, so therefore the cause would be God, right? But in this case, since it's not eternal, it's not necessary, that also means that it had to begin, right? So that brings us to where we're at. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. Okay, now the last video we watched talked about all of the scientific evidence that we said supports that, right? And again, I think it's important because even as I watched this atheist guy, I watched a whole video about why he's not a Christian anymore. He claims he was Christian, he was Mennonite, and what started his path towards non-belief was that dinosaurs and his belief in the young earth creation thing, and then cascaded from there. And what I'm saying, remember, like when we talked about the Big Bang and all that sort of thing, from my point of view, I'm agnostic in many regards to that sort of stuff. Only because if we're going to be very strict with this, it just doesn't, like, you know, doesn't say matter-of-factly that this is the case. So it does say that it began, right? In the beginning, God. So when it comes to, because I know there are Christian organizations that are fine Christian organizations that attack the Big Bang, and that's fine. There's no holy grails, right? Like you can go after whatever you want. And like, again, the science will bear out what it bears out, and that's fine because this will come out okay in the end. But what I'm saying is, don't start with a preconceived like idea, like this must be the case, because again, there are solid Christians on both sides of the argument. That's all I'm saying, right? So they must have and I would recommend, if you're into this sort of thing, there's an excellent book by a guy named John Lennox, who's very smart, and he has a book called 7 Days That Divide the World, and he talks about all the each of these positions, and here's the strong points, here are the weak points, and it's worth at least taking note of that, right? I personally think that when certain groups or people like plant their flag in the one thing and they're like, I'm going to die on this hill for like 7 literal days, like that's not a hill it's not necessary, right? You don't have to plant your flag there, right? You're not compromising the integrity of the Bible. Like, again, you can disagree, but I think that that's too strong of a stance to say, because again, there are even within the text, like, you know, did Adam name all the animals and realize that he was by himself, kind of lonely in 24 hours? Maybe he did. I don't know. It's a long day, but who knows? Right?
So barely name one character.
Yeah, it does. So my point is, even within the text, it's not like, I know that they're like Ken Ham's, like, you know, you're reading in millions of years and Yom, and the number is always like, I've read all his stuff. I'm well aware of all that stuff. I'm just saying that, like, when you talk about the scientific evidence for our purposes, just being very general, it does point to a beginning of the universe. That's all we're concerned with. All right. So we're just going like minimal things here. So whether that started 7,000 years ago or 14 billion years ago, that's an in-house debate.
Wasn't the Earth here before creation?
No. You mean before things were created on the Earth?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it says that in Genesis, right? The Earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, so on. Right?
That's confusing.
But just that it was there, but there wasn't life on the planet. So that's what it's
So
saying.
how was it there before it was created?
Well, it wasn't there before it was created. It was created in the beginning. Because in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Ah. Right. So again, you see where I'm going with this? Like, again, for our point, like, I think those are in-house conversations that you have among Christians. If you want to debate like age of the universe. But when we're talking about just defending this, you don't want to get off on a rabbit trail with somebody about those things. We want to stay. It's kind of like when the Jehovah's Witnesses come to your house and knock. You can get off on all kinds of side tangents, but like when they come to my house, I like to talk about who is Jesus. Let's keep coming back to that one. Who is Jesus? Because that's the important topic that we need to.
They're the ones that put
Jesus was a god or something. They replaced the
Yes,
word
and he's the
with a.
he's the archangel Michael. And he's
Oh,
not-
yeah, I heard that.
So,
Yeah.
and the same thing with the Mormons, right?
Papa
There's not a lot
taught
of
us
Mormons
about
here.
that. They literally just replaced the word a, and there's no explanation for the translation.
Right, but it's not just that. They have other
Yeah.
things too. But what I'm saying is when they come and talk, like you can't get off on side things. You stick to the point here. Like, this is the crux of the matter. So what I'm saying for this, again, I'm not just dismissing those things they're interesting things to think about. But for what we're dealing with here, if we're just defending this, all we're saying is that the universe began to exist. Right? So that's kind of the point. So the last video was the science side of it. The second video I want to show you today, he just put this out like a month ago.
Spaghetti monster one.
Well, we'll get to that.
No one asks about that every single time.
Watch it.
We'll watch it today. But this one there's the philosophical side of this.
No, go home.
Oh,
Goes
yeah.
home every day after this and just watches that video.
The answer to that question is yes.
Yes.
Why does it have 13 displays? It's too rare, dyslexia.
At least there's one.
Okay, so this one, like I said,
100.
It's
100,000.
Yeah, no.
In spring.
Not 100,000.
100,000.
You know when you said it.
No, it's not
Yeah.
100,000.
When you have a family.
It's only one.
And you're
You
older.
said-
I'm
you
gonna
said-
totally find
All right, here we
go.
So-
You shut up. You right there.
Or has it existed from eternity past? If it did have a beginning, this raises a question. Did the universe have a creator? In part one, we explored this question scientifically. Now let's look at it philosophically. Aristotle believed the universe was eternal in the past, but Al-Ghazali disagreed. He pointed out that if the universe did not have a beginning, then the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But that's a problem, because the existence of an actually infinite number of past events leads to absurdity. It's metaphysically impossible. Why? The mathematician David Hilbert illustrates the problem by imagining a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, all of which are occupied. There's not a single vacancy. Every room in the infinite hotel is full. Now suppose a new guest shows up and asks for a room. The manager says, sure, no problem. Then moves the guest who was in room number 1 to room number 2, and the guest who was in room number 2 to room number 3, and so on to infinity. As a result of this shuffling, room number 1 becomes vacant, and the new guest happily checks in, even though all the rooms were already full, and nobody has checked out. And it gets even more absurd. Suppose an infinity of new guests show up at the front desk. No problem, says the manager. Then she moves each person into a room with a number twice that of his own room. So the person who was in room number 1 moves into room number 2. The person who was in 2 moves to 4. The person who was in 3 moves to 6, and so on. Since any number multiplied by 2 is always an even number, all the odd-numbered rooms become vacant, and the infinity of new guests gratefully checked in. And yet, before they arrived, all the rooms were already full. It gets even crazier when the guests
I know,
start
I
to
saw
check out.
that.
Suppose all the guests in odd-numbered rooms check out. In that case, an infinite number of people have left the hotel, and yet there are no fewer people in the hotel. But suppose instead all the guests in rooms numbered 4 and above check out. In that case, only 3 people are left, and yet exactly the same number of people left the hotel this time as when all the odd-numbered guests checked out. Thus, we have a contradiction. We subtract identical quantities from identical quantities and get different answers. These absurdities show.
And if you think about it, you could get an infinite number of different answers from the same. So
Thanks for
infinite
making
minus
that more
infinite
confusing.
And
So,
an
but
infinity of
that's what the
infinites.
point is. It doesn't
Negative.
work.
Show that an actually infinite number of things cannot exist in the real world. Here is a second argument Ghazali offers against a past eternal universe. Suppose that for every one orbit Saturn completes around the Sun, Jupiter completes 2. The longer they orbit, the further Saturn falls behind. Now, what if these two planets have always been orbiting the Sun from eternity past? Which has completed the most orbit? Strangely enough, the number of their orbits is exactly the same, infinity. But that seems absurd, for the longer they orbit, the greater the difference becomes. If the universe has always existed, then an infinite series of past events has been formed by adding one event after another. It's like a sequence of dominoes, falling one after another until the last domino, today, is reached. The problem is that the final domino could never fall if an infinite number of dominoes had to fall first. So today could never be reached. But obviously, here we are. It's today. So the number of events leading up to today could not possibly be infinite. The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality.
It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play
is solely that of an idea.
Then how do you explain the number pi?
What objections might be raised to these arguments?
Numbers aren't
For the
real.
fact that, unlike the rooms in Hilbert's hotel, the events of the past don't all exist at the same time. But we can easily tweak the story to get rid of this objection. Suppose the hotel has been under construction from eternity past, one room being added each year. How many rooms would there now be in the hotel? An actual infinite number. So if the past is infinite, that would imply that Hilbert's hotel could exist, which is absurd. Others have objected that an actually infinite number of things do exist, namely numbers and other mathematical entities. However, this objection presupposes that numbers really exist, but this is a highly disputed assumption that most philosophers reject. So if Ghazali's two arguments are right, then the universe is not eternal in the past. It must have a beginning. And we know intuitively that whatever begins to exist requires a cause of its existence. Thus, we are led to conclude that the universe has a cause of its existence. So what caused the universe? Atheist Daniel Dennett says the universe caused itself. But this is incoherent, because in order to cause itself to come into existence, the universe would have to exist before it existed. The cause of the universe must therefore be outside of the universe, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. Much like God.
Wow, that was a jam.
My goodness, my brain hurts already.
That was
What's
hard
this
fun.
YouTube channel? Are all their videos like this? Dr. Craig.
No.
This is all from William Lane Craig. It's the guy that wrote the book.
These are like my favorite videos on YouTube.
Dude, my brain
Like,
hurts.
I could just not watch any of the other YouTube videos I watch and just be totally happy. Because if you everything that they say in these videos, it's just using facts that we already know. So any one of us could come to the same conclusion if we just thought about it enough. Like we don't need to
Goes
know
exactly
anything
along
else.
with the book too. No, okay, so there's some stuff we have to unpack. So you said what about pi, right? Now, if you paid attention to what they kept saying, they kept talking about an actual infinite number of things, right? Can I erase some of this stuff? Do we all know the 4 fundamental questions of life?
Yes.
Can't even erase it.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
been there
too long.
for like
All right.
2 months.
So we have an actual versus potential.
If you draw over it, like the red one and then erase the red
Right.
one, it erases.
So the difference is if the universe is actually, like they said, infinite in the past, like so if this is the timeline and here's today, and if it's infinite in both directions, like the problem is, like they were saying, like you can't start from today and count and reach infinity. Like you'll never be like, 9,875,003 infinity, right? Because you can always keep adding one more. So you can't ever get there. So that's the problem. It's potentially infinite. So like pi is potentially infinite, but you would never be able to get to the end of pi. So it's not an actual infinite number of things. So you can have potentially infinite number of things. Does that make sense? The problem is if, again, we're talking about an actual infinite number of things, if time is infinite in the past, then the problem is you can't count down from infinity to today, because where do you start?
Yeah.
Do you go back a billion years and then another billion years and another? You see what I'm saying? Like there's no starting point. So you can't get from infinity to today because it just keeps going back forever and ever and ever. So it's impossible. Just like you can't count to infinity, you can't count down from infinity.
God created time, right?
Which is the next question, yes.
So obviously the reason why that doesn't apply to God is because God created everything.
Yes. So that I don't know if you can.
It's because you can't.
Can you guys
have-
see this on the TV
Because
there?
then if God didn't create time, then technically he would have existed since infinity past. But then obviously,
Right. So
because then where did we begin?
Flip the
along
TV a
the-
little bit, so I don't. The people at home can see this. I don't know if they can see.
It's too high.
You're gonna have to
up
take
here.
that
It's not-
camera.
You have to tilt the camera.
Camera.
I got you.
Whoever's the tallest person here.
Well, that's not.
The testing.
It's actually Mr.
Just
Klein.
touch the. No, you don't have to do that. Just
Sorry.
touch the camera and then push it up. Yeah.
There we go. All right, we'll just leave this then.
Whoa.
Is it
Yes,
showing?
yes.
Yep.
Ian's a GoPro legend. He can deal with this.
GoPro.
GoPro
I haven't
legend.
used that thing in
We gotta get that
years.
gimbal for this camera. Man.
Gimbal. You remember the name? That's impressive.
You don't even remember the name?
Yeah, I
Okay,
was trying
so
to think of it.
there are two theories of time, okay, and like hard to remember the names, A theory and B theory. So
Hard.
A theory is what's called temporal becoming. This is time as we experience it. So like on this theory, the past is gone, the future is not yet, and all that really exists is the present.
Sound like Kylo Ren.
Yes, sort of. Right? But that's the way that we experience, right? Like I'm not eating lunch this afternoon because it didn't happen yet. And I'm not eating breakfast because that happened this morning. So I'm here now. And all that exists is the now, which is something weird to think about too. Like what is the now? Because the now keeps changing. Don't worry about that. Right? But that's the A theory, which is the common sense understanding of things. The B theory of time is a whole different thing. And that's when people try to talk about the time space, like time's the fourth dimension, right? The 4D universe. That's what they're talking about, the B theory. And a lot of this comes from Albert Einstein's interpretation of his theories of relativity, that he thought that there is no absolute time in things, so it's all connected by space and things like that. Again, if you want to look into this, Craig has a really good book called God, Time, and Eternity, where he gets into much more detail about all that stuff. There are problems with the B theory. One thing is that the B theory looks at kind of everything as this kind of 4D kind of cube. So you're not just located like along the timeline, but you're also located in space and all that sort of stuff. And the timeline on the B theory would be eternal. So this would have, it's called, I think of it like as a big yardstick, right? Like an infinite yardstick. So there's a beginning of the yardstick and an end of the yardstick, but the yardstick itself has always been there on the B theory. Does that make sense? So when we think of ourselves, like my life would inhabit a certain section of the yardstick. So this would be my life.
Infinite.
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily infinite because it can have a beginning and an end, just that the yardstick itself has been there forever, right? So I could arrange things on the yardstick as earlier than and later than, but that's all equally there. And this is where I think theologically, a lot of people think in terms of the B theory of time, and they'll say like God looks down and he can see the beginning, God can see the past and the future and everything, kind of like God's up here and he's looking down at the whole time span. Because oftentimes people say, well, God's outside of time, which I used to think too until I started really reading and thinking about this. And I was like, wait a minute, there's problems with that, right? Because if that's the case, then so let me illustrate it like this. Have you ever seen like Back to the Future or any of those time travel movies?
Yes.
So that is the B theory. In order to go back to the Enchantment Under the Sea dance and get his mom and dad to kiss at the thing so that
he
his
would be
picture
born,
doesn't disappear and all that stuff, that means that has to actually still be going on back then, which means that the past is equally as real as the present and the future.
Yeah.
And so Einstein actually thought that like when his life ends, that it's not really that his life ends. He's just at that point experiencing this part of his life cycle distance on the timeline, but that the past of his life is equally as real. So he's still alive. It's just that. But to see that the problem is just from an era and this is, remember we talked about the test for truth. Is it experientially relevant? Because it does seem that like as much as I might want to go back to past times in my life, I can't.
And you can't change it.
Right? And it's like the me that's here now seems to be moving through time. Right? Am I right? Like, I mean, it's not like I could just move back. So the problem, like that's one of the issues, because it does seem like the A theory, we're trapped in the A theory. So even though Einstein might think like, well, okay, I'm dying now, but that's okay because I'm really still alive back here in the other. That's not experientially relevant. The other part of it is that if that's true, then think about it. You are really like a different slice of the same loaf of bread, which means that you right now are not the same you that started the class this morning. Because you are like sections of you divided up along this time scale.
How do you divide the sections? How big?
Yeah, I don't know.
That doesn't even make
Maybe
sense by
there's
itself.
an infinite number of sections. I don't know.
By the minutes.
So there are
Already
problems.
proven is impossible.
Right, there are problems like that. I mean, even when you think about things that exist across time, like let's say I compose a piece of music. Like the music is like one thing, but it's not really one thing. It's segmented, and then I would be like a segmented person composing segmented things, and it's very hard to think about that. There's more I could say, but just theologically, the reason why I don't think the B theory is correct is, again, on the B theory, and again, there's good non-theological reasons to believe. Like there's a guy named H.A. Lorentz who also did the math that Einstein used when he did a lot of this stuff. And again, he thought that, like, so for example, if you go up into space, they talk about like the people who talk about time travel say that if you can go faster than the speed of light, that you would actually go backwards in time. You ever hear that? Like
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah.
Superluminal velocity.
Wouldn't you just see what happened back then?
Well, because again, the point is that as you go in space, like they know that like the time slows down. They can measure that. Now, what Lorentz said is that actually the time slowing down has to do with the instrument that's measuring the time. It doesn't actually mean that time itself is slowing down. It's just the way that the physics work on the instruments that are measuring it. So that, you know, again, if you watch some of these space movies, people go to space and they come back and it's like 1,000 years later on Earth and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
According to Lorentz, that's not the way that it would work. Right
Now, would you be able, if you could go faster than the speed of light, would you be able to see what happened? Because
I don't know. They have discovered
you get-
superluminal velocity particles, which is kind of weird because that would actually mean that they would go back in time, which they're not. So I haven't read enough about that. But here's
from the 1850s.
Here's the theological part of this is if B theory is true, that means that time and all the things that are here would be co-eternal with God. Right? So we could still talk about the universe like beginning to exist. Like the whole idea of like the Big Bang and it's spreading out.
Mhm.
You could still do that on the B theory of time. You just say like it goes from the beginning until now, but that would mean that this is all co-eternal. You see what I'm saying? Which again, that's not what we want to say, because I think the Bible teaches what we said is creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That means that they weren't there until God created them. Does that make sense?
Wouldn't that mean that so God existed and there was no time? 'Cause he
Right.
had
So
created it.
that would mean that you're in the A theory of time. So
But
what?
then wouldn't that mean that when he created time and put himself into time, that he underwent a change in who he was? He went from being infinite and unbounded by time to being something that could only exist in time, and that would be like a change to his very
And could he come
core
out of time?
being.
Okay, great question. Does God change?
No.
Yes.
Here we go.
Right.
Well,
So
he
that-
changed into man, didn't he?
He didn't change though.
Yeah.
Did he exist as man before?
So okay, that's a great question, and this is where Thomas Aquinas gets stuck on some of this
Well, he
sort of stuff.
poured himself
Because-
out, right?
Because
So much
Thomas Aquinas thinks that because God is immutable, he's changeless, that there is no potentiality with God, so that everything that God is, that's who he is, right? And so he can't change. But again, if that's the case, then essentially God he's frozen, right? Because remember, what's time? A measure of change. So if we think of it like that, what I'd say we want to say, again, just for sake of time, I would say we want to say that God's nature doesn't change. Who God is in terms of his attributes and his nature doesn't change. But how God is in relation to other things can change. Like, so for example, does God know that right now we are having this conversation?
Yes.
That's only possible if this is true. Right? Because again, there is no really right now on the B theory, because for God, all time would be equally real. But here's the theological problem, right? So let's say here's today. Here's the incarnation. Was the second person of the Trinity, did he always have a second nature, the nature of being man?
Well, it said that he was made for a little while, a little lower than the angels, but I don't think he was always like that.
I agree.
But it also
maybe he
says
was
the
just
Lamb
hiding
of
that
God
part of
slain from the foundation of the world,
All right, so what does that mean?
that it always was.
That was he always slain? Or for this hour I have come? Is Jesus still hanging on the cross?
No.
Not to us.
Because is it finished?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
He said it is finished.
So if it's finished, so if this is the cross, can Jesus still be on the cross? Because if he's still on the cross, and this is true, that means that like those sins aren't really, because remember in Romans 3 it says because God knew that Jesus essentially was going to die, so that's how he could be just and the justifier of those who believed before the cross, because it was credited to them essentially, right? So again, on the B theory, and here even this, on the B theory, say this is heaven.
I have several problems with your graph. Your lifespan is
Yeah, your
before
lifespan is
today, and
before
heaven
today.
is now.
I don't have an infinite amount of space here, right? So if this is the new heaven and the new earth, right? The old heaven and the old earth are still equally real. So they're never done away with either.
So that basically means our sins are never really,
So they're never
really
really,
forgiven because, or
well, they're forgiven, but they're still there.
Yeah,
And
because-
you are
yeah.
still doing, you're
the
still
sins
sinning
because everything
back
is
here,
basically
even though
happening.
you're here in eternity.
Yeah.
Because the past you would be equally real.
Stop. Chill, bro.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So for theological reasons, I think this is a better view. Now, we can talk more about the times thing, because and I'd be happy to do that, because I think that's an interesting theological question. But I would say, did God exist in a changeless state if it was just God, the Trinity? Because remember we talked about like omniscience. Was God the Father talking to God the Son prior to?
I don't think so.
No, why?
because he wasn't.
There was no
sun yet.
time, so it can-
Well,
So the sun got created?
well, wait, if, I missed that.
So the sun, based on what Ian just said, it says there was a time when the sun was not, and God created the sun, which means that the sun is
No, he
forgotten.
didn't exist in
If he
human
didn't
form.
exist, well, he didn't exist in human form, but he did exist.
Yeah,
had
he
to,
existed
or
as
else
the
Jesus
sun.
created,
He
and that's
existed
not
as a
God.
son, but he didn't exist in human form.
Right, but even that, like before that, like so when God, you know, like let us
Yeah.
make man in our like triune God, when they were there, I would say that no, they weren't talking because again, if you're omniscient, is there any need to communicate?
No, you're all knowing.
You're all knowing, right? Because you
You're
already
talking
know.
to yourself.
And see that,
For
so
eternity.
that's something too that's hard to think about because again, that's omniscient in a timeless sense. So then when you think about that in connection to this, when we get to slain before the foundation of the world, did God know everything that was going to happen? Yes. So he knows that. It's not like God's surprised by anything. Okay. So like and even when you get into foreknowledge and like the whole predestination and all that, so it's like who he foreknew, he predestined. Like, is God surprised that I got saved? No, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's causally determined, right? It's just that he knows. Because if he didn't know, then he wouldn't be omniscient, right?
Mhm.
So I mean, he has to know these things. But what I'm saying is, since he knows this in a changeless sense, that wouldn't imply change until God decided to actually create. And then the action of creation, because some people get onto this too, they're like, did God decide to create before time? Because that would be time, and how does that all work, right? It would be simultaneous with the beginning of time, right? So the moment God said, let there be, boom, then that was time. Although Craig will argue too that God could have had a series of mental events and that would constitute time too. Like maybe he said, all right, we're going to create, and he counted down 3, 2, 1. Time would actually have started with the 3, 2, 1, but that's just
Okay, I'm gonna start time real quick, guys.
Start time back up.
Already done.
Just run time back.
So,
Let's go.
Question. When people get saved, right, their name gets written in the Lamb Book of Life. Now, was everyone who will be saved, is saved, and has been saved?
That's like Calvin.
Was their name written in the Lamb's Book of Life before the world was created? Does it get written when they're saved? When does that happen?
That's like Calvinism.
well, I don't know because
Are they?
I
Is
don't,
God writing it down as the? time of the world is
it
gone?
may be that, because like when Moses said to blot my name out and then talked about the other people be blotted out. So I know that there are some, I forget, I looked at this one time and I forget, but I think the conclusion that I thought was that it seems almost maybe that like you're in there by default and then you get blotted out. So then you're not there.
Oh.
Wait.
I have heard that.
Right.
So
Oh, you're in there. Oh, wait. So when you sin,
Yeah.
then you get blotted out,
I don't know.
Well, you're
and then you get written back in when you
Wow,
get
that's
there
a lot.
later.
No,
That's a big process.
I would say
Maybe
again,
a lot of
I'm
white
not,
out.
I don't want to get
Oh, they just
dogmatic on
said,
this because
oh,
I have
wait,
to look at it.
They got forgiven.
But, and I don't know that it says specifically, but
Could you find videos that would explain that?
I don't think it would be, no, I don't think it would be
Blotted
that
out.
when you sin, I
Oh,
think
they
it would be
believe
like
that
when you
white
die,
out.
you would be blotted out, right?
Blotted out of the Lamb's Book of Life.
Because again, like even though I sin, that doesn't necessarily mean that I've lost any hope of salvation. David.
Oh yeah.
I mean, say no more, right? I mean, I think
I
he's
sinned.
saved, but you know, he murdered, adultery, and you know, like keep going on the list, right?
I
But
sinned.
he threw himself on the mercy of God, and through faith, he was in the Lamb's Book of Life. So that's what I would say.
That's an interesting
I know.
idea. I never actually thought of that before.
All right, I would like to keep talking about this. So think about more questions about time, and I'll pull some videos up that talk about time too, and we can talk about this more because I think it's an interesting. Again, these are kind of more in-house questions, like theological questions, where you don't necessarily have to get into all this stuff to make the argument work. But I do think that the A theory of time is the better theory of time, right? Because again, there are big theological problems. There's big metaphysical problems. Just like I said, like I feel like I'm not the different person than I was when I came in here. It's still me. I feel like I'm still the same person,
It's
right?
like the Sesame Street with the witch and the girl, and she's changing around all the different objects.
Still me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sesame
Yeah.
Street.
My kid, I wasn't allowed to watch that.
No, this is Sesame Street.
I didn't never. We weren't.
That's
Did we ever watch that?
That's from like the
It was in,
70s.
like,
It's a
we
whole-
were-
Wow.
All right, you guys have any questions at home?
Big
The Muppet
bird.
Show. Oh my goodness.
I've seen
The
it.
Muppet Show is the best show ever.
All right, so
Blues
let's
Clues.
close with prayer. Let's close in prayer. Lord, we just thank you for this time again, that as we think about time, that we can think about you and think about your creation and like we have talked about, the way that we can know you through what you've created. We pray that you would help us to continue to think about these things and to explore who you are and how great you are, and that we may be able to use this understanding to reach out to those who don't know you and to present your love and offer a forgiveness to them. So again, we just pray that you would bless our efforts in this regard. We thank you most of all for the Lord Jesus Christ and the salvation we can have through his finished work on the cross. In his name we pray, amen.